Hey Salties, it's Caribbean Chris from Saltwater Smarts. I'm back with episode number 2 of Salt Speak. Today I'm going to be talking with Thein of Tidal Gardens. We're going to be talking about coral propagation, the current state of the hobby, and some of the legislation that could affect the hobby. So stay tuned and I will touch base after our chat to fill in any blanks. Okay, today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Thein of Tidal Gardens. What Tidal Gardens is a coral propagation greenhouse in Northeast Ohio. Yes, Northeast Ohio. So we're going to let Thein tell us a little bit about his business and what they do there. So I guess to start it off, Thein, you know, we walk into it, we're at MACNA, we walk into an elevator, I see Tidal Gardens on your shirt. What is Tidal Gardens?
I always struggle with that elevator pitch. I shouldn't because, working in like venture capital and stuff, that is a very, very common thing to work on is an elevator pitch. So whenever anybody asks me what it is I do, I always like struggle to like come up with anything cohesive. So I just say I do aquarium stuff. Long story short, it's aquarium stuff because 99% of the time, people have no idea what coral even is, whether
Right.
it's an animal, whether it's even alive. They have no concept of it. So I just say I do aquarium stuff, generally speaking. But for the hobbyists, what Tidal Gardens is, it's an aquaculture greenhouse where we basically farm corals and we ship all over the country, mainly to other hobbyists.
Okay, awesome. So what are some of the common varieties that we would see if we walked into your greenhouse?
Well, we try to have a very, very wide selection of just about anything. So there's, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of different types of soft corals, stony corals, LPS, SPS, pretty much the entire gamut. We can't propagate everything. There's definitely some corals out there that are just not propagation friendly, like a large acanthophilia, for example, which is a very,
Right.
very large, meaty coral. You're not going to really run that through a saw. It's not a great idea. But pretty much everything that we can get our hands on that we can reasonably propagate, we try to do so.
Awesome. So for those that aren't familiar, Than is also our contributor at Saltwater Smarts. He was actually our very first contributor back when we started almost 2 years ago at this point. So recently he published a post on our site where he basically unveiled the award-winning business plan that started Tidal Gardens almost 10 years ago. So, and you mentioned that won you $32,000. With that plan, how did your projections pan out? I mean, does it look at all like you planned 10 years ago?
No, not so much. But that's okay.
Right.
The Whenever people are talking about business planning, there's always this portion of the business plan that involves, financial projections. And the value of that plan isn't so much in how accurate those projections are. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but really the value are the assumptions that went into making those numbers in the first place. And when you further analyze like why those assumptions were right or wrong, that's like the big benefit. So you can really, solidify just your thought process based on the stuff that you got right, and then start tweaking where you got things wrong.
Okay.
So I think that 99.9% of all business plans out there that do any kind of relatively good financial projections are going to be completely off base. That is par for the course.
Makes
But
sense.
but where you want to be very, very strong is in the thought process behind where those numbers came from. And so when you are wrong, you can identify why you were wrong.
Okay. So that's in terms of financials. What do you think in terms of what you thought the facility itself would turn into? Has it grown more than you thought? Not as much? Are you still getting there?
Um, so I would say that our facility is more of a labor of love than a sound and responsible financial investment. Let's just call it that. So I basically have like a blank check mentality when it comes to what goes on at the greenhouse. So if I think that there's something that can help out, something that can make things look better, whatever it is, it's pretty much cost no object. And I don't really think of it in terms of break-even points and stuff like that. So in that sense, I'm still very much a hobbyist. But as far as the facility itself, whenever you kind of project what something like that might cost, you can pretty much triple whatever your initial expectation was. And that's just to begin with. That's before you get into like some luxury purchases in here and there. What sometimes people don't quite realize about setting up something like Tidal Gardens is it has to be robust on the absolute two worst days of the year. The one day that it's going to be 110 degrees outside and the power fails, and it has to survive a minus 30-degree winter day where your heating fails. Because it only really takes about 8 hours of severe downtime for you to lose absolutely everything in the place. So a lot of times I get a lot of inquiries about how somebody can start their own greenhouse or warehouse or whatever. And I think a lot of the inquiry really is about how can I do what you did, but for less? And that is a bad, bad thought process right off the bat. You do not want to try to do this for less. The first thing is you have to make it work. And to make it work, like I said, it has to be able to withstand the most brutal conditions imaginable. Because if you have that one bad day, you could be done.
Right. So, especially in the last couple of years here in northern Ohio, we've definitely, probably, I would say in my lifetime, it has been the worst winters I've ever seen in terms of cold. So, I mean, I know you've been dealing with that, but how do you feel about that moving forward? Have you kind of cold-proofed yourself as much as possible, or are you still working on that?
I think we always try to improve things. But yeah, there's just some certain realities of physics where if you have a heated 80-degree greenhouse that's has basically 100% humidity, and you exhaust that humidity outside, it turns to ice instantly when it's minus 30 out.
Right.
So sometimes like the exhaust system for our heaters will just suddenly fail because it just cakes on ice on the outside of it. So I have to walk out, at 3 in the morning and chisel out my heater and restart the furnace, that sort of thing. And that's probably never going to stop just because the reality of the situation is, yeah, it's a very, very humid thing that's exhausting to an extremely cold environment. So in that sense, yeah, there's not a ton you can do. But for the individual tanks, things like that, you can always tweak your heating system to make it more efficient, stuff like that. But that's a constant ongoing thing you just have to play with.
Okay. So, I mean, this is a great point to discuss this. What would you say the pros and cons are of propagating inside of a greenhouse versus just inside of a house or a warehouse or something similar?
Well, I think most people, if they knew nothing about growing coral in a greenhouse, would say, "Oh, you get free light." And in reality, what Tidal Gardens is turning into more and more and more is much less of using sunlight. And in fact, it's trying to reduce the amount of light that comes in. Um, it tends to be way too bright in the summertime, and so a lot of time that we spend is just trying to hold on and make sure stuff doesn't completely crash during the summer. So what you eventually kind of end up with is what sort of looks like a warehouse because everything is kind of dark. You're using a lot of artificial light. But the real benefit is not lighting at all. It's the fact that it's a greenhouse itself, meaning that it's made of aluminum and polycarbonate. So you can spray down the entire thing, assuming you don't wet down your lights and stuff. And that's a big deal because pretty much when you're dealing with the type of volume that we're dealing with, we have about 5,000 gallons. And if I had to do it over again, I would love like 15 to 20,000 gallons. When you're dealing with that type of water volume, it would eat any conventional structure, just gobble it up. Drywall, insulation, anything like that is completely toast in that type of humid environment consistently. And that's probably the best thing. Like if I had a spill, let's say, and a tank decides to drain 400 gallons under the ground, it's okay. I'm in a greenhouse. You do that where someplace where you're paying rent, that's going to be a problem.
Right.
That's going to be a call to the insurance company. It's going to be an issue. So that is like the number one best thing. It's that you work in this industrial, super robust, practically bulletproof building that you can do anything you like to.
You know, back to the lighting bit. When we visited the greenhouse, I'll admit I was guilty of the same misconception of, oh, free light. This is great. But when we walked in and saw how hard you were trying to dissipate that light before it reached your tanks, and then on top of that, you were adding thousands of dollars in LEDs over these tanks
Oh,
as well.
yes.
It was a real eye-opener for me, and I would venture to guess the vast majority of people have no idea that's what you battle in a greenhouse.
Oh no, and when we were starting it out, we really didn't know what to expect either. So, I mean, I was in fact under the impression that things weren't going to be getting enough light. So my greenhouse was completely wide open at first and just like letting direct sun practically, hitting these corals. And I remember seeing some brain corals. Basically, their flesh was bubbling from
Wow.
from this. Like there, you could actually see bubbles forming inside their flesh as a result of that. So, yeah, I mean, it's some of there's really no guidebook to this. I mean, even my business plan being out there, that's not exactly a guidebook either.
Right.
There's really no roadmap to success. It's kind of one of those things where you have to really figure it out, and make every mistake in the book before you're really successful.
Right. So, do you have any indication how someone's experience with a greenhouse, say in Florida, is compared to yours? Are they having an even tougher time cutting down on light?
Honestly, I haven't seen any places. I know that there's a lot of places down in Florida that have tried it or are still currently doing it.
Right.
I cannot imagine how they do it, to be perfectly honest. Like the physics of what goes on in Florida are so different than what goes on here. I think that their systems would be completely unrecognizable from what I do. And going back to the lighting thing again,
Hmm.
this is before I had set up a greenhouse at all. I was at the Waikiki Aquarium in Hawaii, and they used to have a coral farm, quote unquote, tank that was outside, in like intense tropical Hawaiian sun. And there had these acropora that I swear were day glow bright. They looked like they were lit from the inside. That's how incredibly colored they were.
Wow.
And they were under the brightest light I could imagine. And I know that like if we did that to our acropora here in Ohio sun, it would not go well. So it's a strange dynamic when you're talking about this as these different locales and like what happens to coral when you try to grow under the sun. And it's kind of unexpected what you kind of end up getting.
Right. Definitely. Okay, well, let's kind of swing over to the environmental impact side of the discussion. So, in terms of good and bad, what would you say the impact is of coral aquaculture? And then, you can kind of compare it to mariculture processes, and then, of course, wild collection.
Gosh, where to even
A
begin?
loaded subject.
It is, yeah. So I am very, very, very pro aquaculture, obviously. And I guess there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think it's anytime you can kind of lessen the burden on natural reefs, I think that's generally considered a positive thing. It's good for the hobbyists because typically aquacultured corals tend to be a lot more healthy, a lot more, I guess, well situated to home aquariums. They're much more robust once you actually have them in your tank.
Right.
Um, but as far as like an overarching I guess, policy benefit to aquaculture. I think it plays well, I guess, politically, but really it's more just like a kind of like an educational highlight thing that kind of you want to have out there. But in the grand scheme of things, is it really helping the oceans? I don't know. I don't know because I mean we sometimes it's very, very easy to get kind of like tunnel visioned on your particular industry. But the saltwater aquarium industry, especially when you're talking about coral, it is like 0.0000001% of just the pet hobby. And then when you compare that pet hobby to like the global seafood trade.
Right.
It's nothing. I mean, it's literally it's so statistically insignificant. So kind of saying that, oh, our efforts in aquaculture are helping the ocean in some way, it's probably not. And conversely, our effect of actually doing the collecting wild, it looks really bad, but mathematically, when you look at the actual impact, it's probably also insignificant compared to tuna harvesting, for example.
Right. So would you say moving forward that aquaculture, mariculture, and wild collection all play a part, or do you think one of those could be phased out and the hobby could still continue as is?
I think that if wild caught were to be phased out, it would probably not go so well for the hobby, for the simple fact that you would have um, other, I guess, other variables coming into play that people might not expect. Like, for example, um, saltwater manufacturers that make sea salt might say, you know what, this might not be the business to stay in. And so you have to go back to what it was 30 years ago, where everybody had to make their own salt water from like test tube stuff, like making like literally element by element their own salt water. So, I mean, it kind of depends. I would say that it's always a good discussion to have because I kind of look at people like myself almost in the same way as I look at like hunters. They look really bad on the surface. It's like, oh, you're killing animals, you're
Right.
taking animals from the wild, you're doing all this stuff. But when you really consider the people that have the most vested interests in protecting the environment, hunters are way at the top of that list.
Right.
They are like fiercely defensive of the places where they go hunting and the animals that they go hunting for. Whereas I think that most like regular Joe walking down the street that has no, I guess, stake in that particular pursuit, they might just say, oh, hunting is bad. You shouldn't kill animals.
Right.
But in reality, the hunter is doing much more for the environment than just a random person. And yeah, similarly, I think that the people that are critical of this hobby don't quite understand that when like a hobbyist looks at a video of a coral reef, for example, I mean, like immediately they see that and they see like, oh, that's $10 million in coral that I'm looking at. And very, very few other people on Earth would have that same perspective.
Right. So, I think our hobby and, hunting, to be honest, just has a really bad PR problem because, one bad situation gets filmed or photographed and the media blows it up. And we really have no counter to that other than, no, we feel like this is a good thing, and that really doesn't help the situation. So,
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. And maybe like the stuff that could make things look bad look really bad.
hmm
So there is definitely a risk of that. And also just there, I mean, not just from the industry end. I mean, I think there's irresponsible hobbyists that,
Yep.
they're perfectly okay with like releasing animals back into the wild. That's not a good idea.
Right.
But they've, we've done that as an industry, as a hobby. So that's not
So,
great.
yeah, right. So that kind of segues right into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the legislation that could affect this hobby. I mean, it could very well remove wild collection and more, just like you were talking about. So, what are your thoughts on that whole situation? I don't know how much you've tracked it or pay attention, but what are your initial thoughts?
My initial thought that it wasn't a big deal at all. And I know that I think like, you and I quite disagree on that point. But so just some background information for some of the listeners that might not be aware. So there was a recent NOAA publication, NOAA.
hmm
That's a kind of like the regulatory body that kind of deals with like ocean related issues in the United States, and they came out with a list of roughly 22 corals or something like that that may be put on either the threatened or endangered list. So the industry, I guess, like through its how would I describe it? I guess kind of through their lobbying arm,
hmm
was kind of concerned about this because anytime that you have corals being put onto that list, um, there are some restrictions that come along with that. And if the rationale for why those corals are being put on that list are increasingly vague, that could really, I guess, be that slippery slope where more things would be banned, and then more and more and more based on that prior precedent.
Right.
So I actually read this document, and it's like 1,000 pages, okay? And they really go through a lot of different, I guess, perspectives on why these specific things may be threatened in the wild. And it seemed perfectly reasonable to me. And they don't have complete data, because how can you really? But every single one actually addressed, what their recommendations were, and they did include, their thoughts on the impact caused by, the reef aquarium trade. And basically, in every single instance, they said that it's probably insignificant, and they make no recommendations as far as limiting that trade. So I kind of take that at face value. I mean, if their recommendation is do nothing, I have a harder time getting concerned about future, I guess, future legislation that would block trade. Now, having said that, I think what people really should be more concerned about is actual extinction. Um, when we're thinking about stuff being put on a list, but if in nature these corals really are being threatened to the point of extinction, you don't have to worry about them banning the trade of it. It's going to be gone.
Right.
And I think that the people that don't dive very much probably don't appreciate this quite as much as people that do. But the reefs are 100% struggling. I mean, it is abundantly clear to me. So if a study was like a pretty good study was done showing how threatened these animals are, I kind of believe it. I have no doubt that there's a lot of species of corals that we're not going to be seeing in about 20 years.
All right. Yeah, it's always, when anybody talks about the struggling reefs, I always have to think to the folks that I see when I go diving down in the Keys, for instance. If you talk to them about 30 or 40 years ago, they'll say the reefs looked amazing, and now it's not even a fraction of what they used to be. So it's definitely a tough situation in the natural environment, no doubt. So,
yeah, yeah, definitely.
It's
Well,
definitely
I think people and coral don't mix. I mean, I guess going back to just my like Hawaii example, if
Mhm.
anybody has like the I guess the luxury of visiting Hawaii, go visit Oahu, which is like where Honolulu is, and Waikiki. That's the very very touristy area.
Right.
And then go to some place like the Big Island, which is kind of like more rustic, more agricultural. They do all the coffee and stuff right around Kona.
Hmm.
And then compare those two reefs. Like one has very, very, very few people, one has tons of people in hotels. And you tell me which one actually has something that resembles a reef. I mean, if you go to the Big Island, as soon as you step in the water, you're stepping on parites, like 1 inch into the water. Whereas to do something similar in Oahu, you'd have to swim out 300 meters.
Right.
So, I mean, it's so clear. People mess up everything when it comes to the ocean.
No doubt. No argument there. Okay, so swinging back into the hobby side of it, what would you say is the current state of the hobby? Are we growing? Are we shrinking? Are we kind of changing course? What do you think?
Well, I think we're growing in the sense that there's a lot more people that are aware of the coral reef hobby as a whole. I think that like the proliferation of a lot of digital media has brought a lot of people in. Whereas before, I mean, I remember when I first started, it was something that was considered almost an impossibility. I remember it's incredibly, incredibly difficult to find information, like back in like 1990 or something like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's hard to find information. The information was probably unreliable. There are certain corals that were considered impossible to keep back then that are, pretty common these days. And I think that there's been so many advances in the industry as a whole that it's becoming more inclusive. And the entire idea of a nano reef was like ridiculous 20 years ago, like completely ridiculous and unmanageable. Whereas like now, I think a lot of people have nano reefs. That's a total thing. That's very, very, very popular.
Yeah, definitely.
So I would say that the growth is it's never going to be something like people have as many reef tanks as cats. That's probably not going to happen. But at the same time, it's definitely grown, and we're a lot better at it, so, which is always a bit encouraging.
Right. So in terms of that growth, there's been a lot of online coral retailers and these basement or garage propagators, as folks like to call them. Do you
Mhm.
think these types of people and businesses are good for the hobby or bad for the hobby, or are you just indifferent about it?
Oh, that's a tough one. I don't. And to be perfectly honest, I was just at the importer today, and we're kind of talking about that.
Hmm.
I don't know where I am on that. Because I mean, I can't say anything bad about them. That's how people start. Like
Right.
people don't start just like, oh, I'm gonna open up a 50,000 square foot place. No, you start in your basement. That's how my importer started. I remember
Hmm.
when I was used to buy stuff from his mother's basement, sort of thing. That's how it all starts. I think that what's frustrating, just from like a, a business competition end of things, is that a lot of people that do try to get into it, um, they don't do a business plan. So first off, do a business plan because they can't do math or something. So you end up with people selling stuff pretty much at a loss, and they don't realize it.
Hmm.
And it sets an expectation that that's the price of something. And and after a while, they're like, I don't make any money at this, of course, because you're selling stuff at a loss. And then they go out of business. But somebody takes their place, and they make that same mistake, and eventually they go out of business. But there's always somebody. So there's always that pressure that's pulling the price down, and it's like this kind of in like an artificial pressure that tends to happen when you have like a ton of people that are doing it all at the same time and constantly rotating out. And so I'll give you a perfect example of what I mean. If you go to a frag show, because frag shows are becoming very, very, very popular,
Hmm.
you can pretty much find them in just about every geography. Go to the same frag show 3 years in a row. And I bet by that third year, you can recognize maybe at most three vendors that were there the first year. So there's a huge turnover in the number of these quote unquote basement guys.
Hmm.
So, I mean, but at the same time, um, that's what's going to spring up out of these basement guys are going to be some really, really, really good guys that stick, that become somebodies that you've heard of. And I think in that sense, it's good. But there is that other aspect of it where it's like there's a lot of like I guess like bloody attrition going on at that price point. When everybody's kind of like trying to go down to that Craigslist level of stuff, which
Right. The bargain
guys,
basement guys.
it's
Yeah.
just not sustainable. Do a business plan, do the math, figure this out.
So do you think that's the only solution that can end the bargain basement life cycle? I mean, is a business plan, or do you think the
Oh
the
no, not
hobby will
necessarily.
rid itself of that
Oh no, I
situation?
think it's just going to be a constant pressure. Like
Hmm.
I think it's just going to be that's just what it is. Well, kind of like throwing that whole business plan thing in there again. I think that a lot of people think that they can do it, and because they can do a fish tank successfully, that's how I started. I started with a fish tank and say, hey, you know what? These corals are growing into each other. I have to prune them back, and I throw away what I've pruned or I try to sell it. And that's kind of how it starts. You start successfully aquaculturing, and you think, well, because I can successfully grow coral, I can start a business and I can sell these corals. And the selling point is where people might have underestimated the challenge. The challenge is never getting or propagating coral. It's always been the selling part. And I think that's where the people that will eventually be successful at this will be very, very good at. It's that selling aspect more than anything else. But before they even get to that, I think that there's a lot of people that are successful basement growers that want to turn that into something, and so that's how it all starts. Um, Now, I guess I was under the assumption that you're buying it at this price and you're selling it at this price, and you're taking a loss unknowingly. But if you can sustainably aquaculture something, then any price is great. like Xenia, for example. I mean, everybody kind of knocks Xenia because it's kind of this beginner weed.
Hmm.
It's our best seller, and it's not even close. Okay, people order it all the time, and
And I
that is
think
something.
people would be surprised to hear that from a company
Oh
like
yeah,
yours, you know?
I would say that we don't even we used to keep track of like the profitability of certain corals. There's no point. Basically, it's like if you buy this and you sell it for like twice as much, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers.
Hmm.
Um, that's one thing, okay? If you can sustainably propagate something, your profits are infinite for that coral. Like the cost of the individual after like 1 year, I don't even know where we got our Xenia. It's been so long. But I know that like over the years, we've sold, no joke, close to like thousands. It has to be in the thousands. So it doesn't
Wow.
matter how much it originally cost us. I mean,
Hmm.
that's ridiculous. But that goes for pretty much anything that you can sustainably harvest. Is that if you want to make the absolute most ridiculous amount of money at this, be a great grower that's able to find a market for your stuff. But that aquaculture aspect kind of like, shows up again. I would love to be able to propagate 100% because it would be such a luxury, just from the money aspect of it. But again, it's hard to propagate everything.
Makes sense. Well, that's some good information and advice for aspiring propagators out there.
Yeah, because I mean,
So,
I see people ask occasionally, like, what's the most profitable coral? And I'm sure some people are thinking like, oh, it's that $600 chalice, $600 per eye thing. No, it's Xenia. Not even close. Not even close.
they
I'll take
probably
Xenia
think you're
over.
lying to them when you tell them that.
Yeah, probably,
Awesome.
probably.
Well, so let's just end on a good note here. What's next for Tidal Gardens? What can people look for?
So we are trying to still sell stuff. Go figure. So we will be doing some live sales. I think we're the only ones that currently do this, but we actually do like about a 2 hour show. We break it up over a couple hours over a weekend, and we actually do a live video feed. And we go through, I don't know, between 100 to like 150 or so corals. And you can join us online live and you can chat with us and all that while we're doing the live show. So if you have like questions about just about anything related to the corals we're showing or just the greenhouse or like, just what's going on, whatever, just you could participate live on YouTube with us. And we'll be announcing when our next one is fairly shortly here. But yeah, that's definitely what's next. I think we're going to be doing a lot more with the live video shows at
Yeah,
Tidal Gardens.
it's definitely an awesome experience. I sat in on the first one that you did, and it's a different way to shop. If you can't be in the greenhouse looking at the corals, it's the next best thing, I guess you could say. So,
Yeah, and we try to make it as interactive as possible. We do contests and things like that, even for the folks that can't directly participate in the sale aspect, because I know that there's folks from overseas. I mean, that we don't ship overseas, so they're really there just for that little bit of back and forth communication. So I think it works out for a lot of different people.
awesome. All right, well, that sounds great, Than. Well, that's about all I have for you today. It's been awesome talking with you, and maybe we'll see you at MACNA this year. What are you gonna?
Yes,
Yes,
absolutely. Yes, we'll have a table there. So
awesome,
if you're going to MACNA in DC, come check us out. Say hi.
fantastic. All right, Than. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
So there you have it, greenhouse coral propagation in a place you might not have expected it. So what do you think about the topics we discussed? Tell us in the comments below. I'm also going to include some links to the Tidal Gardens website and YouTube channel in the description. I have been Caribbean Chris Aldrich. This has been Salt Speak, and I'll see you next time.